with a whistle and a sneeze,
with a horrible creak and a terrible crack,
with a whoosh and a whistle,
with a huff and a chuff, with a clang and a prang, with a crash and a bang, with a clang and a crash, with a crack and a clank, with a splash, a sploosh and a splosh, with a heave and a huff,
with a squeak and a creak,
with a scrunch and a crunch, with a pounding puff and a heaving huff, with a creak and a crack, with a creak and a crank, and a crank and a creak, with a creak and a crank, and a crank and a creak, with a creak and a crank, and a crank and a creak, with a jolt and a judder, with a wheesh and a whoosh and a whistling wind, with a puff and a huff, with a clang and a clatter, with a smash and a crash, with a whoosh and a wheesh,
with a biff and a bash,
with a biff and a bash, and a grunt and a groan, with a gasp and a groan, with a heave and a haw, a shove and a shunt, with a bump and a jump,
with a whoosh and a wheesh,
with a crunch and a crack, with a huff and a puff and a whoosh,
with a splosh and a splash,
with a gurgle and a gush, and a rumble and a rush,
with a bump and a bang and a clatter and a clang,
with a whoosh and a wheesh,
with a splash and a crack,
with a whistle and a whoop, with a wheesh and a whoosh, a hoot and a toot, with a wheesh and a whoosh, and a hoot and a toot, with a wheesh and a whoosh, a hoot and a toot, with a wheesh and a whoosh, a hoot and a toot, with a squawk and a swoosh, with a huff and a puff,
with a biff and a bash and a terrible smash, with a toot and a hoot and a whoop of joy, with a gasp and a groan and a mutter and a moan, with a puff and a huff, with a whistle and a whoop, with a crack and a splash, and a sploosh and a whoosh, with a clang and a prank, with a bang and a clang,
with a whoosh and a wheesh,
with a clang and a bang, with a bounce and a bound, with a flap and a flutter, with a bang and a bump,
with a clink and a clank, with a grunt and a grind, a roar and a rattle,
with a clang and a clatter,
with a croak and a creak,
with a flap and a squawk, with a flap and a squawk, and with a flap and a squawk, with a flap and a squawk, with a smash and a bash, with a clang and a clatter, with a crash and a bash,
with a cough and a splutter,
with a huff and a puff, with a crash and a bang,
with a crash and a bash,
with a crash and a bang,